The modern disease is to keep everything separate, to keep all the disciplines separate. And this is crazy because they aren't separate. Nothing's separate. So all that happens when we insist on ignoring everything else other than our own speciality is that we make fools of ourselves. And why would we want to keep everything separate anyway? Things only become interested when we can relate them to the whole. Things only come to life in that case. Of course, we could say, well, the reason we keep everything separate is there's just too much to know. And in terms of pure data, that is, of course, true. But it's not about the data, it's about the principles, it's about the essential understanding, which has nothing to do with data, has nothing to do with all these things we think we have to study. We can understand it in the click of the fingers. We don't have to digest reams and reams and reams of research papers or anything like that. It's the principles that count, in other words, not the details. So a classic example is the way that in psychological therapies we insist on ignoring all other avenues of human study, human interest, as if that will make us better therapists, because it won't. The more narrow and specialized we become, the more useless we become. And so this is a real conundrum. So we could say, I could say, that if you want to be a really good therapist, then you also have to know about philosophy and science, physics, along with an awful lot of other things, but I'll just stick to philosophy and physics at the moment. So there's a very, very clear example that I can give to try to make this point, and that has to do with the nature of reality, which I suppose, or the nature of the physical universe and the non-physical universe, which I guess is pretty basic. So we need to kind of have some, not ideas about this, but some interest in this. It's got to be something current in our heads. And why wouldn't it be? Why wouldn't reality be something, the nature of reality, the nature of the universe? Why wouldn't that be current in our heads? If it isn't, we've seriously gone wrong somewhere. So the thing about our current understanding of the universe is that there are no things in it, so there's no substance to it. There's nothing we can grab hold of and measure. And there's nothing, no tangible substance that gets to continue from minute to minute, from second to second, from nanosecond to nanosecond. There's nothing there that gets carried on. We used to think that there was, and that actually we had to invent something, the ether, in order to explain physical phenomena. No one ever saw the ether, no one ever detected it, but we kind of had to invent it for things to make sense to us. Then science got to the point where there was no need for a physical medium to be suggested or hypothesized, because our way of understanding things was such that there was just no need for that anyway. There's no need for a physical medium. And because there has never ever been the slightest bit of evidence for this physical medium, just drop the idea entirely, forget about it, move on. It's an idea. It's good to have ideas, but it's also good to drop them. And physics has got on absolutely fine without the idea of there having to be some sort of tangible medium for electromagnetic radiation to propagate in, or for gravity to propagate in, or any type of nuclear force to propagate in. And also, we've also outgrown the idea, the need to have the idea that there's things, that there's stuff, that there's little itty bitty things, electrons, atoms, whatever the hell. We've outgrown that. We don't need to hypothesize that anymore. And there's no evidence for it. And it's unnecessary to think in those terms. It's worse than unnecessary. It confuses us. So that's fine. And that's all grand. But that has ramifications if we suddenly jump to talking about therapy. The reason it has ramifications is because modern therapy is all about controlling, as I keep on saying. And what controlling really means, if we look at things in terms of there being no substance that gets to continue from moment to moment, that there is nothing that gets to continue from moment to moment, is that controlling is entirely meaningless within that context, within that worldview. What would controlling mean within that worldview? There's nothing to control. Controlling means that we have an idea of where we're going. We have a specified and desired objective, and we get there. We wouldn't get there unless we controlled. We'd get somewhere else, and that'd be bad news. But we control, and we get to the specified outcome. So that's great. But if nothing continues, that means there can't be any specified outcomes, because a specified outcome is a projection of what we imagine to be the case. It's a continuation, it's a logical continuity. There's no surprises, it's just a realization of an idea that we already have. And yet that doesn't work, because there is no continuation. There's nothing to continue, and there is no continuation. All there is continual change. That's the nature of reality. There's no thing continuing. Now that's fine. If you're a physicist, you won't sweat over that. That's fine. But we sweat over it because we have this belief. We want to have this belief that there is something that continues. For a start, the ego, the self, that has to continue, right? Isn't that what it's all about? Now, it's certainly true that there is a continuation or perpetuation of the ego, and the ego remains consistent, which is to say it's the same old ego, wearing different clothes, doing different stuff, but it's the same old ego. So how come the ego persists in time? Because we definitely experience it as persisting in time. That's how come we can have stories about ourselves, narratives about ourselves. This happened to me and that happened to me, and this is why, I'm the way that I am, or this is that, and that is this because of that. That's all the narrative type stuff. But if there is no continuation of an ego, how could we have that? And yet our whole lives are narrative. Life isn't a narrative, but somehow our understanding of life is narrative based. And a narrative is a logical continuity, obviously. Imagine trying to write a narrative for a book. There was no logical continuity whatsoever. People wouldn't buy it. It wouldn't be a bestseller. Publishers wouldn't publish it. And yet that's reality. In fact, it's actually way more interesting when it's not the same old thing continuing, because that's a definition of utter frightening tedium. That's the worst thing there is. The unremitting perpetuation of the known, the unremitting perpetuation of the past forever and ever. That's a nightmare, even though we don't necessarily have the imagination to appreciate just what a nightmare it is. It's the nightmare of the ego that has to keep on distracting itself with apparently new things that aren't really new, because anything really new would challenge the continuity of the ego, and that can't be challenged. So how does the ego continue then? Because I've just spent the last 5 minutes saying that it does. And the answer is, of course, it continues, but not in actual reality. It continues in our imaginations. It continues in our thoughts. So the way thought works is that we analyze and observe and measure everything within the context of a framework, a logical framework that we never question. So that's what thinking is, and that's also what the world that thought creates is. It's the world that makes sense within an unchanging frame of reference, which we invented, because there is no unchanging frame of reference, not in reality. But there is when we invent it, and then disregard the fact that actually we invented it. So then what we do, we create this world, the world which exists within the imaginary frame of reference. And we also invent the ego, because that is us living. That's the only way we can perceive ourselves to be existing within this virtual world is as the ego. So J.G. Bennett calls that the psychostatic mode of mind. It's all static. Static means it's all a logical continuum. There's no becoming. There's no radical change. There's no moving on. It's a freeze frame. So we get to exist in this and not really notice it by distracting ourselves continuously with superficial novelty, apparently different situations that are just a rehash of the old situation. And that's the eternal continuation of the old, or of the known, that Krishnamurti talks about, that somehow passes for life, when really it's just an eternal repeat, an eternal rerun. See, that way the ego gets to hang on to itself, which is what it wants to do. So the price it pays is that it lives in a sterile world that is just distraction. And so we all pay that price, because we want to hang on to this fixed, knowable notion of who we are. There's no real reason why we should hang on to it, because everything is absolutely okay and fine and great if we don't hang on to it, because it actually isn't our responsibility to maintain our own beingness. That's not a job we need to do at all. Everything's fine, everything hangs fine just by itself. Okay, so it's true that we never know what the next moment's going to bring. We don't know who we're going to be or what anything is going to be, because it's a surprise, it's something new. But that's okay, that won't hurt us. The nature of reality won't hurt us, because, well, we ourselves are reality, and so why reality won't hurt us. It's like swimming in the sea. If you can swim perfectly well and the weather is very good, it won't hurt you. That's the nature of the sea, is that it's something you can swim in. That's the nature of reality, is that it's continually unfolding something new. It's not going to hurt anyone. It's only going to hurt if we are totally paralyzed by fear and we're clinging on to this fixed notion of who we are, in which case that becomes ontological terror. That the nature of reality becomes the most terrifying thing there is. Way more scary than the scariest thing you might think is scary. So scary that we very rarely touch it or encounter it in its pure form. We've buried it so deep it leaks out in other forms. But if we penetrate deep to the nature of the terror, it is fear of change. It is fear of letting go. It is fear of the unknown. It is fear of not knowing what's going to happen next and not actually knowing what is happening now. And when I say knowing, I mean that we're not able to construct it within a static framework, which is redundant anyway, because there are no static frameworks really. That's just an abstraction of thought. And yet we imagine it somehow essential that we should be able to make sense of everything within this imaginary abstract framework of thought. So in other words, the danger isn't really there. Stuff's just doing what it does. The universe is just doing what it does. Reality is just doing what it does, and it's always done that. Well, that's what it is. That's what reality is. So it will always do that, and there's no problem there. It's only a problem when we start freaking out and thinking, "Oh my God, what's going to happen next?" So to speak. We may not have those exact thoughts going through our head. So we need to know what's going to happen next. I'd like to know what happens. I don't like surprises. Tell me what's going to happen next. But the only way we can have the luxury of that is when we invent a universe for ourselves. And only the same things are allowed to reoccur. And everything else has to be blocked out. So once we get addicted to the security of this situation, reality itself becomes the total enemy. It doesn't have to be the enemy. It's only by holding on to the known or holding on to the fixed, to the freeze frame, that flow becomes the enemy. If we let go, we'd be absolutely fine. We'd be a lot finer than we are when we're clinging on to the known, because clinging on to the known is a long, drawn-out exercise in misery and futility. And we can kid ourselves that it isn't, and we can get away some of the time with kidding ourselves that it's actually great and it's the way things are supposed to be and good stuff is going to happen. And we can actually, probably for the most of our lives, hang on to that idea that, yeah, this is how it's supposed to be. It's going in a good direction. Good things can happen. But still, all we're doing is talking ourselves out of finding out what reality really is like. So the better able we are to convince ourselves that this is how it's supposed to be, this is it, I'm having a great time, I'm living my best life, I'm doing everything that, I need to do in order to feel that I'm making the most of life, the better I am at selling myself that story, the worse it is for me. Because I'm just missing out. I'm missing out on something that I can't imagine. And so I think, well, if I can't imagine it or pre-plan it, or someone won't come and tell me all about it to begin with, so I know that I'm not letting myself into anything too bad, then it can't be that great. I don't want to know about it in that case. Which is how we cheat ourselves out of being actually alive, instead of this situation where we're clinging on to a fixed notion of everything, a fixed notion of who I am and a fixed notion of the world, and yet trying to somehow pass this off as actually living life. As the existentialist said, existence is risk. Reality is risk. Avoid risk, you avoid existence. You get a kind of crappy pseudo-existence. And all this is stuff that the mystics have been saying for thousands and thousands of years. So if you want to, we can go and check up on what the mystics have said. But we can also say it ourselves. We don't have to study philosophy. It's as true for us now as it was true for anyone ever. That the only way to truly live is by taking the risk of existing, even though we don't know what existing is or we don't know what living is. And that all means letting go of control. if I do successfully control, all I'm doing is perpetuating the illusion of who I'd like to think I am because of my fear. So the reason I like to think I am this fixed entity is because of my fear of change. So it's not that there's anything good in the fixed entity of itself. It's non-existent. It's not a real thing. There's nothing good in it at all, any more than there is heat in a glossy photograph of a fire. There's no good in it. There's nothing in it. And we don't love it because there's something good in it. We love it because it offers us a refuge from change, from ungrounded change. So we love it because we have no alternative. It's all we've got. So of course we don't really love it because we'll hate it. So it's a love-hate type of a thing. That's what attachment is. So when I'm attached to myself, it's kind of weird because I hate being myself and yet I'm greedy for it at the same time. That's the conflicted nature of conditioned existence, which is always going to be conflicted in this way. It's like an addiction. I need it, and in some way I could say that I love that feeling that I'm getting. I love it in the sense that it's rewarding me and it's my only source of what appears to be well-being. But at the same time, I hate it. And I hate myself for being trapped in that situation. And I hate the situation because it is being trapped. So that's the love-hate situation with addictions. It's the love-hate situation with habits. It's the love-hate situation that we have with the mind-created identity. We talk about loving ourselves. But there's no self there to love, and there's no self there to love the self. It's just a nasty little knot of holding on when there is nothing to hold on to. So we think everything's about controlling, but mental health isn't about perpetuating the unreal notion of who we're compelled to believe in because we're afraid of the alternative. Mental health is about taking the risk and letting go and seeing what happens next.